Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jenny Reed. If you don't know me already, and I'm the Manager of Indigenous Services at Legal Aid BC. Welcome to this Lunch and Learn on trauma-informed practice. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the unceded territories of the Wakongan peoples, the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples. And we're here today to have a presentation by Dr. Vitaly Cox on trauma-informed practices. I'm going to allow Daniel Johnson to speak briefly about the role that he plays in the presentation of these webinars. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Daniel Johnson. I'm the Lawyer Engagement Coordinator for Legal Aid BC. My role for this organization is to do with lawyer recruitment and training. So for the lawyers in the audience today, I have registered this event for 1 hour of CPD. So if, as of tomorrow, you search the Law Society website for trauma-informed approach, you should be able to find this course and register that 1 hour of credits. If you have any questions, my email address will be in the chat section in just a minute. So please do feel free to reach out to me. And thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I want to also acknowledge I'm wearing orange today in support and acknowledgement of the distressing situation that has developed in the Kamloops area with the 215 children. I think that this particular webinar is timely given that particular situation. And I'm hoping it will give you some tools to assist others, to support yourself, and to have a better understanding of what is happening for people. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Vitaly Cox. Dr. Cox is the director of Eastern Door Center and the Nogemag Healing Lodge in Elsipogtog First Nations, which is in New Brunswick. The Eastern Door is one of the few centers for diagnosing fetal alcohol in New Brunswick, and it has at the forefront of a lot of the research in that area. Dr. Cox is a community researcher and clinician. She's the founder of the Nogemag Healing Lodge, which is an alternative school program for youth suspended from school, in trouble with the law, diagnosed with complex trauma-related conditions. She is also the director of the Eastern Door Center, which offers multidisciplinary diagnosis and intervention. She designed the medicine wheel tools in collaboration with First Nation elders to help provide culturally safe tools for screening, diagnosis, and interventions that also take into account the effects of intergenerational trauma. Her two-eyed seeing assessment tool is based on the work of Mi'kmaq elders Merdina Marshall and Noel Millier, using a system-based approach in designing therapeutic interventions which connect elders with youth and families at risk in the community has significantly improved youth outcome. Many of the youth involved with Eastern Door and Nogemag programs have gone on to complete high school and to live productive lives. She is presently involved as co-collaborator on a 5-year national crime prevention project in New Brunswick and as a principal investigator on 2 CIHR Indigenous research projects. She serves on the executive of the Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Justice Committee and is one of the lead authors of the diagnostic section of the Canadian Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Justice website. She's recently been appointed as adjunct professor at UBC Department of Pediatrics, Faculty of Medicine. And I can tell all of you that I have worked directly with Dr. Cox on the ground as a grassroots practitioner. She is an amazing community resource and support in Elsipogtog and does amazing work. So with that, I want to thank you for being here today, Dr. Cox. It's an honor.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Jenny. And I'm not going to dwell too much today on the historical trauma that all Indigenous people experience the longstanding grief, unresolved grief that is prevalent. Many people, elders have talked about it. Many people don't believe it in the mainstream. And, you know, why don't people get over it? Just stop, you know, just get over these things. But, you know, science has caught up with the elders, the wisdom of the elders, and epigenetics, which I won't talk about today, but shows us that trauma is passed down through generations, that it exists and it's passed down, and there's a basis for it, has to do with methylation, and it affects development and people's experience in the world, and it's serious. And when we do the risk tools for justice, all of the kids, all of the youth that are in the community where I'm working, they are at risk. And so I just want to make note of that. This presentation is more about trauma-informed practice and how to, for lawyers, you know, and legal professionals, how to, in the criminal justice system, how to communicate better and that. So I'll get started with that. There we go. And see if I can get here. There we go. How am I going to get this moving here? Why is this not going? There we go. So what is trauma-informed practice? It's practice that's rooted in the recognition that that trauma and traumatic events in a person's history and family history can affect all aspects of their lives and development, really all around the medicine wheel: physical, emotional, mental, social, spiritual. And trauma in the mainstream is defined as an event that renders an individual's internal and external resources inadequate, making effective coping impossible. And this is from a real good article by Katz and Halyard called The Pedagogy of Trauma-Informed Lawyering. And I have the reference there if any of you are interested. So where did the idea come from? You know, it's really relatively recent. In the last years after the Vietnam War, people recognized that there were there had been real effects of trauma on soldiers returning. Now, this was noticed before. You know, in World War I and World War II, they would say people were shell-shocked and people had all sorts of mental disorders on return, but there was no general recognition of it. But the term PTSD was coined in the 1980s. There was more recognition of it in the DSM-5, actually in the DSM-4, which is the diagnostic and statistical manual that's used by psychologists and also in forensic psychiatry. Then in the mid-late 1990s, there were long-term studies that showed that trauma could have long-term health and mental health consequences. This was very important because I don't think there was any recognition of that before. One of the first studies, it was in terms of women and in terms of women violence and the effect on mental health. And they did this in the US at 27 sites. It was thousands of people were involved. And it resulted in specific guidelines and practice recommendations. And then there was an awareness of the need really generally for trauma-informed practice guidelines. So in 2001, there was a book edited by these folks, Maxine Harris and Louis Fallot, And they coined the term trauma-informed services and started a discussion about that. And each discipline since then has begun a discussion of how their practice could become trauma-informed and how it would change how they related to clients. And so this is true for any, trauma-informed practice. But in terms of trauma-informed lawyering, the lawyer asks clients not what's wrong with you, but instead changes the paradigm a bit and says, what happened to you? What's going on? And there's a little bit of a shift there. So the objectives of trauma-informed lawyering are to reduce re-traumatization in the criminal justice system, which happens a lot, and to improve legal advocacy and to improve the legal outcomes for clients. The first thing is to consider it in terms of what are the sort of principles of, the broad shape of trauma-informed practice. And this is true in any discipline. There's, there's 4 R's. One is the realization that trauma exists, just that shift again, that it can, and that it affects a person's life. Recognizing the effects of trauma in the individual and also how it might affect communication, and then responding effectively by developing a specific approach in your system of practice so that you can ensure that re-traumatization doesn't occur. It would be helpful, for instance, if all aspects, not only lawyers, but justices and police would be aware of trauma-informed practice. So let's talk about realization. We realize that there is an effect. In 1995-97, there was a research study of 17,000 adults that showed that there was a direct correlation between childhood trauma and health and mental health outcomes many, many years later. And this research was then carried out in Canada and many, many countries internationally. So the examples of the health implications have been, they talk about childhood adversity, and there's what's called an ACE score. And for instance, if you have a high ACE score, the likelihood of depression is 4 or 5 times higher, attempted suicide 25 times higher, physical conditions, chronic pulmonary lung disease 3 to 4 times higher, drug and alcohol use 2 to 4 times higher. And it's the experiences that the adverse experiences and traumatic experiences that individuals experience as children affect them, long term. And they've created a pyramid which helps you see the real effect of it, which leading to early death. And there's been a lot of research connecting adverse childhood to disease, disability, social problems, and death. There hasn't been as much in terms of, it hasn't been proven in the same way. There's a lot of associative research out there in terms of the effect on social, emotional, and cognitive impairment and adoption of high-risk behaviors. I'll talk a little bit about some of that later. And then recognition of trauma, like to recognize that it affects an individual in many, many ways in terms of their anxiety levels that they carry with them like throughout their lives, their ability to reason and respond when feeling high anxiety, their brain functioning during development and then throughout life. And there's a dysregulation of the stress response throughout life. It's there's been a lot of research on it. How do you, though, as lawyers or as legal professionals, how do you determine if trauma is a factor in behavior in order to provide accommodations? It's simple if there's been previous disclosure or disclosure during the initial interview. But for the most part, trauma is invisible and people carry it silently. Sometimes they may not even be self-aware of it. And yet we know that it affects the brain and it affects all aspects in terms of functioning, and especially the amygdala and the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. It also affects like the hormonal functioning, where our stress response is activated, and then again this affects, especially during development. Like it could actually the glucosteroids could actually kill the cells in the hippocampus if a child is very young, and the amygdala can get like red hot. Where it's folks are really in a fight to flight response all the time. So long-term dysregulation, there's long-term dysregulation of the norepinephrine and cortisol systems. And there's changes in the function areas, as I was saying, of all these different areas. So one of the things, so we'll just accept that there's been such a lot of research in the animal model as well as with human beings. But for us practically, what does that mean? And we know that, how do we determine it, And if we ask whether a person has been physically or sexually abused, they may not give us an accurate response. They might not even fully understand the word abuse. They may have been taught that it wasn't abuse, that they deserved, what they got. They may have been physically beaten. And yet, if you say, were you abused? They would say no, because they feel, well, it was discipline. They deserved it. If you ask whether they were sexually abused, again, they may feel, even if they were young, 12 or 13, they may feel that it wasn't abuse, that they actually were somehow responsible for it. It's curious, but it's not as simple as it seems. So it's important to be very specific, not to say, were you physically abused? Were you sexually abused? But to be very specific in your questioning. And I find that the ACE questionnaire is actually quite helpful in this, at least in an example of how to specifically ask about trauma, because the language is easy and easy to understand, and it uses concrete examples rather than abstract concepts. And it also doesn't really take much time. And if you could use that, it helps informing the relationship. I wouldn't go into it immediately. I would ask about social, grounded and kind of social relationships. But I think it's a helpful tool during the intake interview to find out about whether trauma is playing a role here. And here are the trauma questions that are asked in this research. Did a parent or adult swear at you, put you down, humiliate you? Did they ever act in a way that made you feel afraid of being physically hurt? Did a parent or other adult push, grab, slap, or throw something at you? Did they ever hit you so hard that there were marks on you or you were injured? Did an adult or person 5 years older than you touch you or fondle you, or have you touched them in a sexual way, or try to actually have oral, anal, or vaginal sex with you? Did you feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Your parents didn't look out for each other or feel close to each other or support each other? Did you feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to care for you? Were your parents ever separated or divorced? Was your mother or stepmother pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes kicked, bit, hit with a fist or something hard, ever repeatedly hit or threatened with a gun or knife? Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or an alcoholic who used street drugs? Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Did a household member ever go to prison? So they're 10 questions. They're quite specific. And if you develop a trusting relationship, they can actually hold a key to finding out the information in a specific way, but also making a bond with your clients. So the fourth part of what we were talking about, and very important part, is to prevent re-victimization. Because without accommodations for trauma, without recognizing it and responding to it, the very systems that we have set up to help people can actually make things worse. And this includes the criminal justice system. And perhaps that's why we see so many people, Indigenous people, Black people in jails, in corrections, and in this kind of, revolving door, because we're not really dealing with the issues that they're experiencing. This may not be the result, their behavior may not be the result of criminality, but really of disability or traumatic events that brings on. PTSD is disabling. And this is true when you're, this is true for the victim, the witness, and the offender. All of them can be re-victimized in their experience. And I think we really need to look with a critical eye at the system and at our approach in it, and try to change our practice to reflect best practice. So part of that is looking at what are in the research, what are the resilience factors? So one of them is relationship, that the client experience one or more stable, caring child-adult relationships. Empowerment, that the client feels they have ability to overcome the past and make choices. Self-knowledge, the client has the opportunity to learn how to manage behavior and emotions. Culture, the client is grounded in their community and cultural traditions. And within your relationship with your client, these are also principles of how to activate your trauma-informed practice. Relationship, for instance, Nogama is a Mi'kmaq word, and it means all my relations. It's a wonderful, very deep concept. And it means relation to self, to family, and to community. And it also, if you start to think about relationship in that way, it can help us looking at resilience factors, and also it can help our clients begin to live in a good way, as the elders say. So in terms of the Nogama 3 R's, relationship, respect, and ritual, if you start with your relationship with the client and try to understand their relationship in the world, not only they've come to you, I know that you're busy, but understand where they're coming from and the kinds of even social trauma that they might experience before they've even come into the interview. And even though you're often in a rush, you have so many clients, there's so many things to do, at the moment of the interview, try to center yourself and slow down and create an environment, offer them tea or coffee, and really explain the process to them, that kind of knowledge of what the system is about. They may not understand what your role is. They may not understand about the court, what they're going to experience in the court. Try to find out more about them and about their needs in the process. For instance, if you have somebody coming from a long way, Try to, find out about, do they need accommodations? Try to help them in whatever way you can so that they can be comfortable and that the whole experience isn't stressful for them. I think respect is really key here. And respecting how the person may be impacted by trauma in their lives and how this could be affecting their functioning and even their way of processing information. Social trauma may have impacted schooling and language understanding and ability to manage their emotions. We know that trauma affects self-regulation because the person is always in a hypervigilant state. And we mentioned that, there's an increased level of anxiety when that our adrenal cortical, hypothalamus system is engaged. We have this fight or flight response. And it also may have been part of the trouble with the law, that difficulty, that anxiety. I find that's true with many, many of the clients. They are impulsive to a way, they think of everything as a threat. And there's this response where they get so anxious that the thinking part of their brain just shuts down and they get into trouble, There are differences because of development. There may be differences in the way information is processed. So it's important when you're communicating to slow down. I'm going to say that again because that's real important. Take time when you're talking for one thought to be processed by the client before you go on to another, and try to use less words if possible. Use visuals if you think there are developmental difficulties. Again, I'm going to repeat that because I think it's very important. So I want to talk about this young man, CP, who was a client in Nelsie. And he was a young man of 17 who had experienced many layers of trauma in his young life in terms of the first trauma prenatally, being affected. His mother drank, and the alcohol works like trauma. On research shows the alcohol works, aside from the actual, organic brain damage, the alcohol works like trauma, like the response is like post-traumatic stress when the alcohol hits the fetus. There's an increase in that cycle, the adrenal hypothalamus pituitary response. And that's the first level. And then the next layer was attachment. He went through multiple families all through his, young life. He was abused sexually and physically. And he spent years in and out of youth correctional facility in Miramichi and was, it was never really dealt with. And he was old when I first older, he actually missed out on a lot of the interventions that we had put in place. He said he felt like the youth corrections in Miramichi was like his home. He was fed there and he knew the people there, but he was afraid. They had told him that if he got in trouble again, he might end up in adult jail. And he told me he was frightened because he had just been charged with breaking the windows in the band office. So I offered him a cup of tea and got him relaxed, asked him what happened, and he told me the story. He said because he was afraid that he would go, he would end up as an adult in jail, which he was scared of. He said he wanted to get work, and he went to economic development in the community to try to get help with getting a job because someone told him that they could help him there. And so he spoke to the man there who was the human resources officer, who I know, and I know he probably wanted to help him. And he asked CP what his career goal was. And CP then told the man that he didn't have any, because that's the standard procedure. The human resources officer asks, what is your career goal? He writes it down. He tries to then hook you up with a job that relates to what your career goal is. But he told the man he didn't have any, and then he just left. And so then I asked him about this because I knew he told me that he wanted to work. And he looked at me for a minute and he said to me, what is a career goal? Like didn't have a clue what the guy was, talking about. And the officer who was, interviewing wasn't able to get the information so that he could help him, and because of his anxiety, he didn't feel safe. He didn't trust the officer enough to tell him that he didn't understand, and he just panicked and he fled. And then he tried at the band office and asked someone there if they had any work, and someone there laughed at him, he said, and he really felt awful. I think he had been laughed and bullied in school a lot. He came in with dirty clothes, he smelled. And so this was part of, again, social trauma. And they said to him, he didn't even know how to read. How could he get a job? And that night he got angry and he ended up breaking most of the windows in the band office. And then he was charged and sent back to Miramichi. And we did get some of the information into the court in a pre-sentence report. We don't have court workers, unfortunately, in New Brunswick, but we do have the probation officer that does a pre-sentence report. We don't have Gladue here. It's a province that's quite, Jenny can attest to that. It's quite old-fashioned, you might say. But in Elsipogtog, we do have a lot of innovate. It's amazing. Like in the community, we have a healing court now that uses a trauma-informed approach, and CP, he's gotten support there and he's gotten treatment, and that's basically been very helpful in keeping him, out of the system as a young adult. So there's been a change, just because we've been able to change our practices, a bit. And the elders are very involved with that. So the guiding principles of trauma-informed practice are for you to create a safe environment for your clients, for you to have an open and honest relation with them, a willingness to answer their questions simply and clearly, and to enable them to be trustworthy, really, to tell them the truth. I think empathy really helps. If you've had any experience, like the experience of being bullied, try to think of some experience that would relate. You don't need to have that that higher professional sort of, it doesn't work with trauma-informed practice. It's like the elders say, it's like eye to eye, it's face to face. You're both equals in here. And so it helps when you can have empathy and relate your experiences to your client, that they will feel that sense of mutuality and collaboration and that sharing of power that's really needed if you're both to engage on this journey together. And you need to respect their voice and their choices there, and I think if you're honest with them about the kind of choices that they are making that are getting them in trouble, they'll listen to you more than if they don't feel that they can trust you and that you have that a collaborative kind of respectful, approach, and also respect of their cultural history and their gender issues. That's a real important key as well. I think that people who have experienced trauma, a high level of social trauma, also lack trust in community service professionals. and they're guarded. And in that, they can withhold important information, aside from not recognizing that they may have had a traumatic experience. They also can withhold information because they fear the consequences of telling you the truth. And I think it's real important to create an environment, like I said, that's collaborative, so that the individual feels safe enough that they can disclose things to you. It won't just happen with words, that if you say, well, you can trust me, I won't tell anyone, that's lawyer-client privilege, and that's not going to cut it. You need to really create that environment and create that sense of trust and collaboration with them. And it's an environment where you can reduce anxiety, because anxiety can then also cause shutdown or even anger. And so again, one of the first things to do is to take some time, even if you're busy, you can take time in a moment that will create a sense of time, that you'll connect with a person. They'll feel that you've connected with them. And you can set it up before they come in, even physically. Create an environment that's physically comfortable, that's emotionally welcoming. Plants, I find colorful cushions where there's no noise or harsh buzzing lights, if that's possible. It may not be possible, but as much as possible, try to even, sometimes I've even brought with me a blanket, that's, just that's colorful. Something that will create, create something that's not so officious, that will relax people. If possible, find out the native language of the person you're interviewing. And if you don't know it, it may be helpful to learn some phrases that'll connect you. If you don't know them, get them to tell you a phrase or two, and then they'll correct. I've often been laughed at, it'll correct your pronunciation. And again, this can equalize the relationship and empower the client. So I'm going to go into here some general communication strategies. And again, general strategies: be patient, listen carefully to better identify facts, the key facts, because often they'll go around. Give them time enough to do that. Allow them the time to tell you their story. There are some specific strategies in questioning. Try to be short and to the point in the questions that you're asking. Try to ask in several different ways to get the information. Avoid multi-step questions. Keep it simple. Avoid complex wording. Allow more time for people to respond and to process the question that you're asking. There may be processing difficulties, especially with anxiety. Give frequent breaks if you sense that somebody is becoming anxious and needs to have a break just to get themselves together, to get a cup of water. Ask them, how they're feeling. Try to chunk information into small pieces and communicate as concretely as possible. If you have any materials, don't just give them to the person to read. Read them out loud, kind of with them. Don't make a point of embarrassing them with their reading level, but don't assume that they actually are able to read. It may be the case that they didn't, that their schooling, even if they graduated high school, they may not be able to read properly. Speak slowly. Use the person's name frequently. Avoid pronouns when you're talking about an event. Use the names of the people involved. Be proximal, be near, but don't get too near the person. If they're having a hard time talking to you about telling you what happened, you can try to get them to act out what happened. Be open to alternative ways of getting the information. it's important to provide the client with cues for any kind of transitions, like in the court, tell them in 5 minutes, the court is going to take a break, so that they're prepared, for what's happening. Always, always check for comprehension, not simply by asking if they understand, because in my experience, they will say they understand. Ask about content, because often individuals can space out or dissociate, and there's like for a minute, and there'll be gaps in their understanding. And so they fill in those gaps, and they really have some of those ways that they fill in the gaps really isn't a reflection of what actually is occurring. So ask about or what you're saying, and they may misunderstand. Exercise patience, and remember that the communication and processing difficulties are not intentional, that they're part of the person's makeup, part of their history. And it's important when you make that shift. If you, as I said before, if you try to use visuals and pictures and diagrams and charts in point form, it'll help. Nova Scotia has some interesting materials for people with communication difficulties that I was able to pick up, which explains in visual form the processes in the court, what people are going to experience. I think that's helpful. I think it's important to remember that you can set up with the court audio or video conferencing in separate quiet rooms as needed, even during the court process. It may be very difficult with the distractions in the court, especially with witnesses. It may be important to do this. So I think use technology as you can. Try to schedule more time if possible for a trial or for meetings involving the person living with trauma. Use court workers. You're blessed to have them out in BC, and they can be essential to the process of gathering information. They can be your allies in this, in your trauma-informed practice approach. It's very helpful to use a multi-source approach, because an individual living with trauma may be unreliable in the sense that in their heightened states, they're not storing memories normally. And so it's helpful. It doesn't mean they're lying. It means that because they're in a fight or flight mode, and they're in that kind of state, sometimes it's almost like a blackout, and they really don't remember clearly what occurred, especially like in a fight situation. And so it's helpful to gather information from as many other sources as early in the process as possible. And you can doing this, it can increase the accuracy of information that you're getting, and also the effectiveness of the court experience, for your clients. This is something that you probably know him, David Boulding, who was talking about a client living with FASD. And he said, I assumed that because we had been to court many times, that my clients would know that they should not interrupt the Crown prosecutor. But that's not necessarily the case. You'll have a situation where people can get so worked up, they'll get angry, especially if they don't understand the process, and the Crown might say something. His story might not reflect what happened, and the person will say, that's, get out of there. See, that get very, that's not the case. I was there, I should know. And, the sort of the etiquette of the court is is not going to be followed. They're going to have difficulty with it. They may shut down completely. They may, lash out. And remember again that the behavior is the result, or can be the result, of brain dysfunction rather than intentionality. And that, if people in the court understand that these folks are living with trauma, then they can understand its origins and have a kind of calm advocacy instead of, conflicting and getting agitated themselves, whether it's defense, crown, court workers, or judge. I think that calmness goes a long way to get people centered again. And I think in terms of so that's the courtroom situation. In terms of sentencing, I think it's important to establish for sentencing whether trauma was a mitigating factor in the behavior of the offense in what happened. This would be for offenders. And again, a thorough GLADU or pre-sentence report would indicate previous diagnoses or risks. You have to ask yourself, is incarceration appropriate for this person? Is it going to lead to, is it going to be helpful, or is it just going to be another revolving door in and out of the system because they're not really going to get help for their basic problem, which may be trauma related. They may need treatment for addictions, anxiety, PTSD, and you need to know whether it's available and whether during or after incarceration or to get these community-based interventions. It's helpful to avoid lengthy or even any incarceration in favor of longer supervision if there's no public safety factor in there. It's helpful to arrange for long-term intense supervision if available, and to ask yourself and try to find out what community or institutional resources are available to assist the person. It's helpful to try to create structure and stability in the defendant's life in the orders. And that you write out and simplify and have them repeat the rules of any kind of orders, and make sure that the defendant's probation officer is trained in a trauma-informed, approach. Else you'll have a lot of breach. They may not be able to provide, understand, and there'll be a lot of breaches, and then there'll be a lot of status offenses, and it'll just spiral. So don't overreact. Try to be calm with all of it. People living with trauma can be especially vulnerable when placed in a custodial sentence because of the way that the anxiety level that they have, and it's the impulsivity, the poor judgment, the fight or flight response, and the poor memory and the heightened state. And so they really can get into a lot of trouble in prison and in corrections. It's wonderful to, if at all possible, to use a mental health court, or we have the wellness court, and if you can, sentencing circles, if you can work together to consider, community justice options, it's very, very beneficial. And what can you do specifically, like in your practice? I think you can try to use the ACE type very particular questions in your intake interview. You can watch for some of the red flags that indicate trauma. And if these are present, make sure to respond using trauma-informed practices. You can advocate for services and work to increase trauma-informed practice within the criminal justice system with your colleagues. But remember, lawyers are not therapists. You need to make proper referrals. And also, I think it's important to recognize when you're involved listening to people's stories, traumatic events in their lives, that you yourself will have a need for self-care. And that recognition, integral to trauma-informed practice, is a recognition of the effect that client's trauma experience will have on the legal professional, and the effects of secondary trauma is similar to PTSD. And we can see it, it's proven in the research. And so I think it's important that you yourself don't push yourself in that sense, that you take some time to reflect when you've heard these stories. And I think debriefing with colleagues can also help. I think you need to educate your employers that and train them in terms of the benefits of trauma-informed lawyering, and also in the needs of lawyers that are practicing and in this way. And just some final thoughts. Trauma-informed lawyering, it reduces re-traumatization of clients by the criminal justice system, whether they're witnesses, victims, or offenders. It helps you and lawyers be better advocates for their clients. When you recognize and respond to trauma and the role it might play in your relationship, it makes you a better lawyer. It's as simple as that, I think. So that's the end. And we have a short time for questions if you have any.
Thank you, Dr. Cox. There is one already, which was this toxic stress the same? I think that was the first question that was, is toxic stress different? I don't know if you can answer that.
I would kind of need a definition of what the person meant by toxic stress. But I would say that if they've been under, and I'll just say what I would think is toxic stress, that if they've been under repeated stress that's, affecting their functioning in a toxic, it's like poisonous, that yes, it would work because it would engage us in the same kind of hormonal, response. And especially if it was long-standing kind of stress that the person was experiencing. But I think there's not been much work on that I've seen in terms of the research and what effect that might have. But I think that it's a consideration. It's certainly, it certainly would, it seems to me that it would be a very similar kind of thing. It would be almost more for professionals, the kind of toxic stress that, professionals experience in their work, in the workplace.
Does anyone else have any questions that they want to ask? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask them if you can.
How do you get past a client's resistance to recognize
the past traumas?
Trauma? There's a number of questions. So what I'll do if we don't have time for all of these questions, I will answer them. I can send by email, I can send, answers, to them. I think the first one that I read that I'm older, I can't keep too many things in my head at one time, but I'll read them one by one. So the first one I read, resistance, how to get over a client's resistance. I think that comes again with making the connection and understanding, starting slow, having this collaborative approach, I've been able to get folks disclosing. You start with the social, and you create the environment. You start with the social in terms of their life, to find out about their relationships, some of their past and their kind of social history. And then when you have that bond, then you would go into asking about the specific, and remember, ask about the specific questions. They will not talk to you if they won't, they'll be guarded and they will resist, and they will feel that they can't trust you if they still feel that top down, that you're in the top looking down on them. And there's this top down professional approach. They need to see, that's why court workers are so helpful. But it's important for you to practice as lawyers, to practice this skill where you can make that kind of connection with your client. It's a skill. It's a gift, really, the gift of making relationship and having people. But it's also a stance, and I think you can actually cultivate it and and learn how to do that somewhat. Lose your professionality in the sense of the top down stuff. Try to relate if you can. And I found that it's helpful. I found that I can, Jenny can tell you about the disclosures that occur. I was able to get, and I continue to get disclosures from folks. I think that you'll find that. I think if you're specific as well, in terms of the person not recognizing and resisting in a sense, because they have stigma attached to abuse, was your father an alcoholic? And they'll say, no, my father wasn't an alcoholic. I mean, he drank every day. He would drink 2 for a beer every day, but he wasn't an alcoholic, and there's resistance to the stigma of abuse, to the stigma of being considered. I think if you ask the questions in a very, not conceptually, using the words alcoholic, using the word problem drinker might be more, or even asking, what was your parents' drinking style, can be more helpful, when asking those kinds of questions. You have to frame everything in a way that again avoids resistance and stigma there. Let's see if we have any more. No, I don't think we have more time.
We can do one more, Lori. How's that?
One more. Okay, let's go.
Could you talk about how some stereotypes of trauma create stigma related to criminalization?
I think that this question is trying to get at is that people will, if, for instance, we talk about the changes in development, I've seen this, before in giving sessions, difficulty, say, with thinking. I've seen it misinterpreted. And I think it's dangerous in a way. I think you have to be careful because there is a stigma when you say something like, well, the person has difficulty with self-regulation. People say, oh, well, they're set up that way. We can't trust them. They're going to be criminals. It's a stigma that's attached because you don't understand about what trauma is and then how to deal with it. It's the same with somebody, for instance, I was at a conference and talking about the difficulty with giving a presentation in Halifax to lawyers and legal professionals about how there was a difficulty with cause and effect reasoning sometimes, especially with people with FASD. And the person asked the question and said, well, that means that we can't trust them to understand. We should keep them locked up. We should be more severe. Yes, I think that you have to be very careful of that. That's for sure, that there's going to be the stigma. But for you to understand and try to get this point across, that because I've seen it, when we take a trauma-informed approach and deal with the basic source of the behavior, where it's coming from, and we accommodate it and we try to find out and help the person learn how to self-regulate, learn how to deal with that kind of anxiety, which is leading them to the aggression, you see a turnaround in their lives. Like that young man, CP. I've seen it. Like, the trouble is that we don't have many interventions in the communities for young adults in this way. We have very few, community-based interventions. We have some for youth, but not very many for young adults. And so the criminal justice system seems to be where they land. And that's our mental health interventions, community-based mental health interventions are not good, are not adequate. At least in First Nation, the First Nation community in Elsie, we have sweats. Some of the cultural traditions actually help folks with anxiety, with trauma-based. Elders are extremely helpful, talking circles. We need to develop, wherever we are, whatever community, we need to develop more resources, mental health resources and mental health courts, and ways in which we can deal with this, population.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to thank Dr. Cox, especially for giving her time and an amazing presentation. The materials will be provided to you by way of email. Any outstanding questions, she will answer, and we will send you the responses. Thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.